You're listening to The Observing Eye. Pirate radio for the mind. Coming at you fresh from the computer hell cabin.
Hello, you beautiful lot. It's Friday, the 24th of May, 2024, and you're listening to episode 66 of The Observing Eye, coming at you live from the computer hell cabin. Every week, we get psychological, philosophical, and all manner of introspective. I'm David, and this week, we're going to be exploring the rather esoteric nature of thought. Have you ever considered, or have you ever paused to consider, what thoughts actually are, where they come from, and how they shape our consciousness? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be exploring in this episode. What exactly is thought? At its core, thought can be described as a mental process of considering, reasoning, or reflecting. It encompasses everything from the logical analysis we engage in when solving problems, to the creative daydreams that transport us to different worlds, to the emotional reflections that colour our day-to-day experiences. In this episode, we're going to dive into the biological underpinnings of thought. We're going to look at the developmental and environmental factors that shape our thinking. Of course, there's going to be some philosophy and theology in there. And then we're going to look at the connection between thought and consciousness. And of course, this wouldn't be The Observing Eye if I didn't try to give you some practical implications as to what all of this means in, general living rather than just random esoteric nonsense. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of it, I want to leave you with a very simple exercise. Well, it seems simple on the surface. Take a moment to pause and observe your thoughts. What are you thinking about right now? How do those thoughts make you feel? It's my therapist head on. Are they logical, creative, or emotional? How does it make you feel? So, get comfortable, open your mind, Quaid, and join me as we get into the fascinating and peculiar world of thought. So we asked that simple question at the beginning, didn't we? What is thought? And it's a dangerously simple yet equally complex and frustrating question. Essentially, thought is the mechanism by which we process information and make decisions. Now, it's important to remember that thinking isn't the same as perceiving or sensing, because perceiving or sensing involve holding something in front of our mind. Whereas thoughts, they're distinct in that they are independent of any of the stimuli that are produced by the thing being thought about. Now, to understand this more deeply, and quelle surprise, I'm going to get philosophical, let's have a look at how some great thinkers have approached the concept of thought in history. Now, we're going to go back and start with ancient philosophy, and we're going to look at one of the earliest and most influential thinkers on the subject of thought, who was Plato, in his theory of forms. Now, Plato proposed that beyond the physical world lies a realm of perfect immutable forms or ideas, of which our thoughts are mere shadows. According to Plato, true knowledge comes from understanding these forms through the exercise of reason. Thought in this context is the soul's way of accessing the eternal truths that exist beyond our sensory experiences. For Plato, the process of thinking is an act of recollection, a remembering of the forms that our souls knew before being incarnated in the material world. Aristotle, Plato's student, offered a different perspective. While Plato emphasized the separation between the material world and a world of forms, Aristotle believed that thought is rooted in our engagement with the physical world. In his view, thoughts are abstractions derived from our sensory experiences. Aristotle introduced the concept of the active intellect, or part of the soul that abstracts universal concepts from individual experiences. For Aristotle, thinking is an active process of interpreting and organizing sensory data, leading to knowledge and understanding. Now we skip forwards a bit and we come across the wonderful world of René Descartes, a pivotal figure in Western philosophy. Descartes famously declared cogito ergo sum, which you all have heard of, I think, therefore I am. This statement underscores the fundamental role of thought in establishing our existence and identity. Descartes posted that thought is the essence of the self. It is through thinking that we become aware of our existence. For Descartes, doubt and introspection were central to the process of thinking, leading to his method of radical doubt, where he questioned the certainty of all knowledge except the fact that he was thinking. This introspective approach laid the groundwork for modern philosophical inquiry into the nature of thought and consciousness. Eastern philosophies offer a different yet equally profound perspective on thought. In Buddhism, for example, thought is viewed as a transient and often misleading phenomena. The Buddha taught that thoughts arise and pass away, and that attachment to our thoughts leads to suffering. Central to Buddhist practice is the concept of mindfulness, the practice of observing thoughts without attachment or judgment. By developing mindfulness, we can gain insight into the nature of thought and cultivate a state of clarity and calm. In the Buddhist tradition, the mind is often compared to a monkey, constantly jumping from one thought to another. This monkey mind can create restlessness and distraction. Through meditation, Buddhists seek to calm the monkey mind, developing a deeper awareness of their thoughts and learning to see them as impermanent and not inherently self-defining. This practice, again, leads to much more peaceful and centered state of being, free from the tyranny of incessant thinking. Hinduism also offers some interesting ideas into the nature of thought. In the Bhagavad Gita, a foundational text of Hindu philosophy, the mind and its thoughts are described as powerful but potentially wayward forces. The Gita emphasizes the importance of controlling and purifying the mind through discipline and devotion. In Hinduism, the mind is seen as a tool that can either bind us to the cycle of birth and rebirth, or liberate us through knowledge and self-realization. Practices such as yoga and meditation are prescribed to gain mastery over the mind and align one's thoughts with higher spiritual truths. Advaita Vedanta, a non-dualistic school of Hindu philosophy, gives us a particularly peculiar perspective on thought. According to Advaita, the true self, Atman, is identical with the ultimate reality known as Brahman, and our sense of individuality is an illusion created by the mind. Thoughts in this view are manifestations of Maya, the illusory power that veils the true nature of reality. By transcending thought through deep meditation and self-inquiry, we can realize the non-dual nature of existence and experience the unity of all being. There we go, word salad kicking in there already. In Western religious thought, particularly within Christianity, thought is often seen as a reflection of the divine image in which humans are created. St. Augustine, an influential Christian theologian, argued that the ability to think is a gift from God, enabling humans to seek truth and wisdom. Augustine believed that true knowledge comes from divine illumination, where the mind is guided by God's light to understand eternal truths. For Augustine, thinking is not just a cognitive process, but a spiritual act of realigning the mind with divine wisdom. In Islam, the concept of thought is also deeply intertwined with spirituality. Islamic teachings emphasize the importance of reflection and contemplation as means of understanding God's signs in the universe. The Quran encourages believers to ponder the creation, the natural world, and their own existence as ways to draw closer to God. Thought in Islamic philosophy is a pathway to spiritual insight and a means of recognizing the divine order in all things. And lastly, Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam, places a strong emphasis on the purification of thought and the heart. Sufis engage in practices such as dhikr, and I apologize if I've pronounced that incorrectly, which is the remembrance of God, and meditation to cleanse the mind of worldly distractions and achieve a state of inner purity and divine connection. For Sufis, Thoughts can be both obstacles and aids on the spiritual path, depending on their focus and intent. Ultimately, thought is a process that connects us to the past, shapes our present, and helps us to envision our future. And now, a word from our sponsor. There is no sponsor, it is just me. In fact, there will never be a sponsor. I feel that allowing an external influence to potentially impact the content of these episodes and what or how I'm permitted to deliver them would fly in the face of the authenticity that I strive for in each episode. So, if you do like what you hear, and if you want to support the podcast, you don't have to give me money. You can just give it a like or a follow on the platform that you listen to it on, and drop us a review. It gets us in front of a bigger audience and helps me to understand what content you all want to hear. Many thanks and much love. So where does thought come from then? How did it evolve? And what factors shape our thinking processes? Understanding the roots of thought can give us an insight into our cognitive functions and help us to understand the way that we perceive the world. So to start, we're going to look at the biological basis of thought. So thought at its core is a product of brain activity. Our brain, which is an intensely complex organ made up of approximately 86 billion neurons, is the powerhouse behind our thought. Neurons communicate with each other through synapses, creating intricate networks that process and transmit information. This neural communication essentially underpins every thought that we have. One of the key brain regions involved in thought is the prefrontal cortex, located, as unsurprisingly, at the front of the brain. This area is crucial for higher order cognitive functions, such as decision-making, planning, and self-reflection. The prefrontal cortex enables us to think abstractly, consider future scenarios, and regulate our emotions. Its development is a significant milestone in human evolution, setting us apart from other species in our cognitive abilities. The evolutionary perspective offers us an idea into why thought developed in humans. Now, our ancestors faced complex environmental challenges that required advanced problem-solving skills. Remember, we were very small and feeble compared to many of the animals that were kicking around when we were living in caves and worshipping fire. So we had to come up with interesting and unusual ways of working things out and defending ourselves. So the ability to think critically and plan strategically was a survival advantage. Over time, these cognitive abilities evolved, leading to the sophisticated thought processes that we have today. Well, sophisticated in quotes in some cases, I feel. But thought allowed early humans to make tools, to build communities, and to develop languages, which were key elements in the survival and advancement of the species. Now, speaking of language, it's impossible to discuss the origin of thought without considering the role of language development. Language is not only a tool for communication, but also a framework for thought. The words that we use and the structure of our language shape how we categorize and understand our experiences. For instance, the concept of time can vary significantly across different languages, which will in turn influence how speakers of those languages will perceive and think about temporal events. Developmental psychology sheds some light on how thought processes develop from infancy through to adulthood. From the moment we're born, our brains are wired to learn and adapt. Infants start by processing sensory information, and gradually they develop more complex cognitive abilities. Jean Piaget, a pioneering developmental psychologist, identified stages of cognitive development that describe how children's thinking evolve. So during the sensorimata stage, these words. The sensorimata stage, infants learn about the world through their senses and actions. As they grow, they move into what's called the pre-operational stage, where they begin to use language and develop memory and imagination. Lev Vygotsky, another influential psychologist, emphasized the social context of cognitive development. He proposed that thought is fundamentally shaped by social interactions. According to Vygotsky, children learn and develop cognitive skills through guided participation and dialogue with more knowledgeable others, such as parents, teachers, and peers. This idea shows us the importance of culture and community in shaping our thought processes. Now, environmental factors, unsurprisingly, also play a significant role in the development and nature of our thoughts. From the family environment to educational systems and media exposure, societal norms, all of those external influences shape how we think. So, for example, a child growing up in a supportive and stimulating environment is likely to develop strong cognitive skills and a positive attitude towards learning. Conversely, exposure to chronic stress or trauma can adversely affect cognitive development and thought patterns. So let's get a bit more into how culture influences thought. So different cultures have unique ways of thinking, often shaped by their historical, social, and environmental factors. So, for instance, this is ultimate word salad this week. For instance, individualistic cultures, such as those in Western countries, tend to emphasize personal achievement and independence. This cultural context gives us a mode of thinking that values self-reliance and personal goals. In contrast, collectivist cultures, common in many Asian societies, prioritize group harmony and interdependence. This cultural emphasis shapes thought processes to be more relational and community-oriented. Another critical aspect of the origins of thought, unsurprisingly, is the impact of education. Educational systems are designed to develop cognitive skills, impart knowledge, and encourage critical thinking. I again put encourage critical thinking in quotes at the moment. I have words to say on that, but that is for another time. The methods and content of education can significantly influence how we think. For example, an education system that encourages questioning and exploration can create creative and independent thinking. On the other hand, rote learning and strict adherence to authority might limit cognitive flexibility and critical thinking skills. Media and technology also shape our thought processes in somewhat terrifying ways. Today, we are constantly bombarded with information from various sources: social media, news outlets, entertainment platforms. This influx of information can affect our attention spans, our critical thinking abilities, and even our mental health. On one hand, access to diverse information can broaden our perspective and enhance our cognitive abilities. But on the other, the constant distraction and information overload can impair our ability to think deeply and reflectively. And even in that statement, I would say that although we may be given access to diverse information, we tend to be corralled into bubbles of similar thinking. So I'm not even entirely sure that I agree with my own statement there, to be honest. Understanding the origins of thought involves recognizing the role of personal experience. Each person's unique history, including their upbringing, education, relationships, and significant life events, will contribute to their individual thought patterns. Our experiences shape our beliefs, our attitudes, and our perceptions, influencing how we think about ourselves and the world around us. This is why two people can have vastly different thoughts and reactions to exactly the same situation. So to summarize all of that, the origins of thought are multifaceted, and they bring in biological, developmental, environmental, and cultural factors. Thought is a product of our brain's neural activity, shaped by our evolutionary history, influenced by our social interactions, and molded by our personal experiences and cultural context. Understanding these origins gives us a much deeper understanding, an idea of the complexity of thought and the various factors that contribute to what happens inside our internal landscape. So now we've covered thought as much as I can in a short enough time frame. I could talk hours about thought, but obviously this is not designed to be this is not Joe Rogan. I cannot go on for 4 hours. Let's talk about thought and consciousness. Specify a bit more about what consciousness is, and explore that. I'm just going to say I'm recording this on the iPad today, so the audio quality might not be quite as good as you are used to, and I apologize for that. But yeah, And I'm not editing much out of it either. I'm just recording each section and dropping it into Adobe Audition. So it's gonna be a little bit more rough and ready than usual. But hopefully that gives it some character. So where was I? Consciousness. Consciousness is one of the most profound and perplexing phenomena in all of the things in psychology and philosophy and neuroscience. It encompasses our awareness of ourselves and our environment, and it provides the foundation for our experiences, thoughts, and emotions. So thoughts exist within consciousness. Now, despite its centrality to our human existence, the nature of consciousness remains incredibly elusive. At its core, it's the state of being aware and able to think, feel, and respond. And it includes a range of experiences, from sensory perception and bodily sensations to thoughts and emotions. Consciousness is often contrasted with unconscious processes, which occur without our awareness. So that's things like breathing and heartbeat regulation and the lymphatic system and all of those things that happen without us thinking about it. But of course, then we have conscious thought, which is, like the act of deciding what to have for dinner or which pub to go to. So that's conscious deliberation. Now, the study of altered states of consciousness provides us with an interesting window into its nature. Now, altered states of consciousness can be induced by various means, and that can be meditation, hypnosis, sleep, and psychoactive substances. Each of these states offers us a perspective on the flexibility and variability of the conscious experience. For instance, during a deep meditation, practitioners often report a heightened sense of awareness and a profound sense of unity with their surroundings, suggesting that consciousness can be expanded and deepened through specific practices. Now, as a Buddhist, I can ascribe to some of this stuff with meditation. It can get funky. And it's something I'd recommend everybody tries. But I'm not your dad. I'm not going to push it on you. You do what you feel comfortable doing. Sleep, for example, particularly rapid eye movement, is another area of interest in the study of consciousness. During REM sleep, the brain exhibits high levels of activity and vivid dreams occur. These dreams are a form of consciousness distinct from wakeful awareness, characterized by their own logic and narrative structures. The study of dreams has led to various theories about the function of consciousness, including the idea that dreams may serve to process emotions, consolidate memories, and simulate potential future scenarios. Neuroscience has significantly contributed to our understanding of consciousness by identifying brain regions and neural networks associated with different aspects of the conscious experience. Techniques such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is fMRI for you acronym lovers, and electroencephalography, which is the EEG, have allowed researchers to observe brain activity in real time and correlate it with conscious states. The prefrontal cortex, for example, is implicated, as we mentioned, in higher order cognitive functions like decision-making and self-awareness, whereas the thalamus and the reticular activating system play roles in regulating wakefulness and attention. One prominent theory in neuroscience is the global workspace theory proposed by Bernard Boors. Oh, my eyesight's terrible. Bernard Boors. I think it's Boors. Yeah, B-O-O-R-S. GWT suggests that consciousness, yes, I'm reading from a script. GWT suggests that consciousness arises from the integration of information in a global workspace, a central processor that receives input from various specialized neural modules. When information is broadcasted to this global workspace, it becomes available for conscious awareness and can be accessed by different cognitive systems. This theory emphasizes the integrative nature of consciousness, where disparate pieces of information are unified to create a coherent experience. Another influential theory is integrated information theory, developed by Giulio Tonali. IIT posits that consciousness corresponds to the capacity of a system to integrate information. According to this theory, the level of consciousness is determined by the degrees of information integration within the brain. There's a lot of big words in here and I'm struggling. Systems that can integrate information in a highly interconnected manner are said to process higher levels of consciousness. IIT provides a quantitative framework for measuring consciousness and has implications for understanding consciousness in both biological and artificial systems. Psychological approaches also explore the subjective quality of conscious experience, often referred to as qualia. Qualia are the individual instances of subjective conscious experience, such as the redness of a rose or the pain of a headache. The study of qualia delves into the question of how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experiences. The hard problem of consciousness, as coined by philosopher David Chalmers, remains one of the most challenging questions in the study of the mind. Philosophical perspectives complement psychological theories by addressing the fundamental nature and implications of consciousness. Phenomenology, a philosophical approach founded by Edmund Husserl. I'm going to zoom in because my eyes are rubbish and I'm sitting too far away. So you're going to have to just bear with me for a minute. Right, I've zoomed in, I've ruined my flow. And it's moved everywhere I am on the page. This is fun, isn't it? Right. Should we start that again? Phenomenology, a philosophical approach founded by Edmund Husserl, focuses on the structures of experience and consciousness. Phenomenologists seek to describe the lived experience of consciousness, emphasizing the first-person perspective. You are not the main character. This approach highlights the richness and complexity of conscious experience, challenging reductive explanations that overlook the subjective dimension. The philosophy of mind also explores different models of consciousness, such as dualism and physicalism. Dualism, most famously articulated by our friend René Descartes, posits that consciousness is a non-physical entity, distinct from the brain. In contrast, physicalism argues that consciousness is entirely a product of physical processes in the brain. These philosophical debates again highlight how intensely complicated this idea of consciousness is. And I don't know where I stand on this. Maybe I do. I would say I'm probably more of a dualist than a physicalist. I don't actually necessarily think that consciousness is entirely derived from the brain. Whatever that means to you, you take that as what it is. I don't think that we're just biological computers churning information. I think that there is more to it than that. Maybe that's just me being romantic, but I do feel that there is more to the human experience than cells and neurons. Now, interestingly, advancements in artificial intelligence and machine learning have raised unsurprising questions about the potential for artificial consciousness. While current AI systems lack the subjective quality of human consciousness, although that is becoming, the gap is lessening, ongoing research explores whether machines could eventually develop forms of consciousness through increasingly sophisticated neural networks and algorithms. And if we go back to what we were saying earlier about, one of the definitions of consciousness is the capacity for a system to integrate information. Surely, based on that principle, you can expect AI to become conscious at some point. The more information they can integrate, the closer they get to it, I guess. So, the nature of consciousness, I'm giving you these things to think about. I'm not giving you a definition of consciousness. How can I? I just want you to have some thoughts and ideas around what consciousness is. I want to help you to think about it and to give you some pointers for things you can explore on your own if you're feeling sufficiently motivated by that. It's a profoundly difficult and tricky conundrum, and it's not something that I have an answer to at all. I think the closest I've got to trying to understand it is through my Buddhist practices, and I don't even know how to elucidate some of that stuff into words. Really, it's just it's experiential. It's entirely experiential, and if any of you out there have meditated a lot and you've got to a certain depth with it, then I think you'll understand where I'm coming from on that. Now, of course, it wouldn't be the observing eye, would it, without, well, we've already done the philosophy bit. Now we're going to try and talk about some practical implications about what all of this stuff actually means. How does this long diatribe, well, it's not even a diatribe, is it? It's just me. along, and I'm not really ranting too much, how this sort of discussion around thought and consciousness, how you can take that and do something with it in your lives, because we don't live in these philosophical bubbles, do we? We have to go to work and pay bills and feed children and get the car fixed and get stuck in traffic trying to get into like Tesco's or something to buy food for said children, and then put up with tantrums and clean the house and all the other crap. So, day-to-day life doesn't necessarily give us the luxury to consider the nature of thought and consciousness, which is why we're here, which is why we're opening this window into it for a brief period. So let's talk a bit about mental health first, because I think that's probably going to be the most important and significant applications of understanding this stuff. So I'm going to start with okay, I'm going to give you some bias here. I'm going to start by talking about cognitive behavioral therapy, which is not really my favorite form of therapeutic methodology, but it's a prime example of how recognizing and altering our thoughts can lead to improved mental health. And I say this with a pinch of salt because I don't feel that CBT is the best option for all cases. And I'm not going to go into that in too much depth because I feel like that's outside the scope, but you get what I mean. So CBT operates on the premise that our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors are interconnected. Negative thought patterns can lead to emotional distress and unhealthy behaviors. So by identifying these thoughts and challenging their validity, we can break the cycle of negativity and create a more positive mental state. Far easier said than done, in my opinion. So let's think about someone who experiences a lot of anxiety as an example, right? So they might have a recurring thought like, I can't handle this situation at all, it's outside of my control, blah, 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 all of the death spiral that happens in anxious thinking. So CBT can help them to recognize this thought as a cognitive distortion, which is a negative automatic thought that isn't necessarily true. Through CBT, they can learn to reframe it to something more constructive, such as this situation is challenging, but I can take it one step at a time. I would say to people, deal with what's in front of you, not the future shit that you can't control. So by changing their thought patterns, they can potentially reduce anxiety and approach those obstacles with a bit more confidence than they would have had before, which was none, essentially. Now, another powerful tool for mental health is mindfulness. Mindfulness practices rooted in meditation traditions teach us to observe our thoughts without judgment. This non-reactive awareness can be extremely healing, because when we observe our thoughts mindfully, we create a space between the thought and our reaction to it. And this space allows us to choose how we respond rather than being driven by automatic reactions. Now, I like to think of mindfulness a bit like, I am, I've been doing this for like over 2 decades. I'm a software engineer by trade. I do not make money from this podcast. I do this for the lols. And I like to think, I like to think of mindfulness a bit like when you're debugging a piece of code. And for those non-developers out there, which I imagine is a fair few of you, I'll just briefly explain what that means. So if I write a piece of code, let's say I've got a piece of code that's 100 lines long, and I run that code and it doesn't do what I expect it to do. So in order to understand and find the fault, I put in something called a breakpoint. And what that does is it runs the code line by line, and it allows me to step through every line of code, and it allows me to stop and look at that code and examine what that code is doing and what the output of that line is. Mindfulness is very similar. We're kind of putting a breakpoint in our thinking. So we, instead of imagine our negative thought is the entire 100 lines of code running. The code runs, we have a negative thought. Mindfulness is like putting a breakpoint in that thought. So it stops mid-thought and we can examine it. And we can go, okay, so what's the output of this thought? Where's it coming from? What's causing this thing not to work quite as we would like it to? And to me, that's kind of the essence of CBT. It's like debugging our thinking, essentially. Now, obviously, understanding our thoughts has huge implications in the personal growth space. Reflective practices such as journaling, meditation, and self-inquiry give us some space to explore our inner narrative and thought patterns. by regularly examining our thoughts and getting them out of our head and onto paper, I think journaling is a fabulous way of doing this. We can get some real insights into what our motivations are, what fears might be coming up, and our potential desires. Now, if we understand that, then it kind of gives us more leverage to make better decisions and to make more informed choices about the actions that we're taking in the world at large. So going back to journaling quickly, like externalizing those thoughts and reflecting on them can give us a really different perspective. And it's very similar to why people go to therapy. You need a mirror to reflect back these ideas to you. I cannot remember, I think it's a Buddhist statement or quote, I can't remember exactly where it comes from, but the quote is that the observer cannot observe itself. So when we are in the thought, it's really difficult to observe the thought and to understand the connection between that thought and everything else that's going on in our consciousness. So writing stuff down creates that space between the thought and the response. When we come back to it, we come back to it with, maybe we're in a bad headspace or we're pissed off or something, and we journal what we're thinking, and then when we come back to it and we're in a much calmer emotional state and we're thinking more rationally, it becomes a lot easier to try and think about where that came from, what triggered it, what caused it, and why we might be responding and reacting in that particular way. So that all of this stuff, observing, self-inquiry, observation, journaling, meditation, these are all incredibly powerful tools that we can use to try to understand what's going on with our thoughts. Now, another practical application is in the realm of relationships. Now, I mean relationships in terms of our dynamic with everybody else, not just our romantic relationships. So our thoughts significantly influence how we perceive and interact with others. And by becoming aware of our thought patterns, especially those involving judgment and assumptions, we can improve our communication and our relationships. So if we notice, for example, a recurring thought, not a referring thought, this thought refers you to here. If we notice a recurring thought, like they never listen to me, we can examine its validity. We can do a little bit of Socratic questioning, and there is an episode I did all about Socratic questioning, which I will point you to in the show notes. We can examine the validity of this, and we can consider alternative perspectives, and we can question whether this viewpoint is actually right or not. And by doing this, it helps us to understand our motivations better, and it helps us to be more empathetic with others, which in turn gives us healthier relationships. And of course, lastly, understanding thought can significantly improve our decision-making processes for all of the reasons above. Because our decisions are influenced by cognitive bias, which are systematic patterns of deviation from rationality. By being aware of these biases, such as confirmation bias. Now, confirmation bias, for example, would be like what I did earlier, where I said, I don't particularly like CBT, but here is an explanation of what CBT is. I'm giving you confirmation bias because I've said, I don't like this, but here it is. So you already have an idea in your head that this is not good before I've explained it. So I do my best not to give people confirmation bias, but sometimes it just happens because I feel like it. Or, it just slips out. It just slips out of my mouth. No, there's a joke there, but I'm not going to go there. So yeah, things like understanding what confirmation bias is might influence us, for example, allows us to make better decisions because we're understanding our prejudice, our judgments. So if we knew that we tend to overestimate things, if we knew, I'm going to rephrase this, if we knew that we often responded to events much more dramatically than they actually are, then it can help us to get a better perspective because we can counteract some of that catastrophizing, because we can catch it, we can debug that catastrophizing moment, and we can go, hang on a minute, is this as bad as it looks like, or is it just me just overly dramatizing the situation? We can ask ourselves these questions, and the more we ask those questions, and the more we use like actual evidence, which is the thing that is happening in front of us, the reality of the situation, rather than our perception of that reality, then that's going to help us to nip some of those unhelpful thinking patterns in the bud. So that's pretty much all I've got to say, and it's a long one today. Pretty much all I've got to say. That's what she said on the nature of thought and consciousness. So we've looked at the essence of thought. We've delved into its origins. We've seen how it relates to consciousness. We've looked at some practical ideas about how you can take these things and use them in your lives. And of course, we've dived into some philosophy and theology. We know now that thought arises from the interaction of neurons in our brain, potentially. I know, well, they do. I'm not saying potentially, they do. But, I like to feel that there is a more spiritual context to it than just that. See, there's confirmation bias for you. We know that the prefrontal cortex plays a crucial role in higher order cognitive functions. And we've looked at theories like integrative information theory, global workspace theory, to help us to understand how our thoughts contribute to our conscious experience. Now, I'm going to leave you with a couple of takeaways, not food. I'm not giving you a delivery order, but a couple of takeaways to think about after this episode, just to ponder, just to leave at the back of your mind and let the gears churn. So firstly, recognize that your thoughts are powerful. They shape your perceptions, influence your emotions, and they drive your actions. By becoming more aware of your thoughts, you can gain greater control over your mental and emotional well-being. Second, and this is very important, remember that thoughts are not fact. They are often influenced by cognitive biases and distortions. By challenging and reframing unhelpful thoughts, you can develop a more balanced and positive outlook. And third, this is a suggestion, embrace the practice of mindfulness in whatever way, shape or form you feel is appropriate to you. You haven't got to go and meditate, you can journal, you can do self-reflection, all that kind of thing. Observing your thoughts without judgment, and that's tricky, I say that, but it's tricky, it takes practice. Observing your thoughts without judgment can create a sense of clarity, helping you to work through the challenges that are thrown at you with a bit more resilience and a bit more presence. Tackle the things that are in front of you, not the stuff that's off in the distance. Thought and consciousness are central to our human experience, and understanding them can open doors to deeper self-awareness, enhanced mental well-being, and richer, more meaningful lives. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all I have to say on the subject of nature. No, on the subject of the nature of thought and consciousness. As always, I want to thank all of you for joining me today, sticking with this gargantuan episode. This was a bit of a beast today. I really hope that there's some stuff in this that you can take away and that's going to be useful to you and that you can actually apply to life. And that, maybe you've learned something as well. That's always a plus. So yeah, thank you, genuinely thank you to all of you for choosing to spend your time listening to an old guy prattle on about thought and consciousness. It's very self-indulgent. Now, as always, if anything in this episode has resonated with you in any way, then I would love to hear from you. Here comes the stop bit. You can share your stories via Substack at theobservingeye.com or on social media. You can find us on YouTube at youtube.com/@theobservingeye and on TikTok and Instagram with the handle @theobservingeye as well. Take care, everybody. Much love, and I'll catch you soon.
You've been listening to The Observing Eye. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I hope it's been useful. And if you're interested in any more of my writing or work around psychology, philosophy, and general day-to-day living, please go and take a look at my Substack, which is theobservingeye.com. And that's I as in the letter, not I as in the gelatinous organ through which you see. Take care, everybody. Much love, and I'll catch you soon.